If you've been following me for a while, you probably remember this foliage and grass brush set that I released a couple years ago. It's free, it still exists, go download it if you want, but now it has competition. That's right, it's time for Grass Pack number 2, aka my Grass and Fields expansion pack, and it's time for a painting demo. This brush pack is focused on just grass and fields with a trees and foliage expansion planned for a couple months from now. In this pack I wanted to focus a lot more on just grass and go deep instead of broad, so if you want 144 brushes all designed to help you paint beautiful, shiny, biodiverse grass, you're in luck. You can download these brushes from my Gumroad store. It will be linked down below. Go grab the old pack too if you want because there's no overlap. Just like all my brush packs, they're free, but tips are welcome if you feel so inclined. And they're also royalty free, so you can use them in anything you want, including things you sell. I posted unlisted video intros for each of the programs these brushes are built for. Watch one of those first if you want, they're all about 10 minutes long. You start off with the block-in brushes. These are for building the base that will become your field. Most of them have color variation already built in, but I still recommend shifting your color around to get darker and lighter to build out these horizontal stripe zones of alternating colors that flatten and compress as they approach the horizon line because of perspective, like how a gigantic circle painted on the ground will start to flatten and look like this as it approaches the horizon line. We can use this technique with patches of lighter or darker or warmer or cooler grass as it moves back in space to indicate perspective in our field. We can also build in these little pockets of darker shadows in the foreground. This will give us something to build on top of with detail brushes to create dimension in the grass closest to the camera. I learned from the best. I'm using painting brushes for this. I included these, even though they're not grass, so I can make TikToks saying I painted everything with one brush pack. And also so you can follow along with this whole tutorial and any future ones I make using all the same exact brushes as me. So I wanted to paint a big mountain scene with a lot of depth for the cover of this pack, something kind of majestic. So I started by sketching in my mountains and then working my way toward the camera, keeping in mind that thing about perspective that we talked about earlier. So really flat shapes up by the horizon that open up as they come forward in space toward the camera. Right by the camera, I wanted a lot of dimension, so I even gave my grass a form change, a front plane. Then I added some rocks and plants and a path and some other stuff to break up the grass and make it a little more interesting. I merged the sketch into a single layer and set it to multiply and started painting underneath. I like to start at the back of my canvas and work my way forward. It helps me envision the painting like a real 3D space, where things furthest back will be at the bottom of my layer menu, and things closest to the front, aka the camera, aka the imaginary camera that's capturing the scene that I keep referring to, that will be at the top of the layer menu. Next, I'm using the color variation blocking brush to add some color variation to the sky, and getting to work with the watercolor painting brush to block in the clouds. This brush is designed to have just partial opacity, so when you build up layers you get an organic, washy, kind of painted look. And then I've used the painting rake to add some texture and the soft blocking brush to add some dimension. I'm using the wobbly detail brush to block in these mountains now. I really like digital brushes that give you some organic variation and happy accidents, because painting traditionally generates a lot of noise just due to like the paper texture and real bristles. But digitally we have to kind of reverse engineer that effect. So that's what I'm going for with my painting brushes. Rough edges, that little bit of extra grit. As we move toward the camera, those mountains become grassy foothills, which I'll break up with some rocks and render with some light and shadows. And now it is time for the field, the main event. I start with really narrow stripes of color up by the horizon. I'm trying to vary the temperature, the saturation, and the value. So warmer grass, cooler grass, grayer grass, darker grass, stuff like that. Now I've got to block in the rest of the field as it comes forward. So I start by making my block-in brush really small and then slowly increasing the size of it as I move toward the camera in space. I'm going between a couple different grass block-in brushes here. They're all in the block-in folder. I use the ground brushes to block in a path and then paint on top to give the path some cast shadows from the grass. I use a selective color adjustment layer to bring some more richness to my painting by bumping up the magentas. I really love this tool, one of my favorite features of Photoshop. Other programs have similar stuff too, like color balance, which you can use to do close to the same thing. I use the painting brushes to block in most things that aren't grass and ground here, just alternating between them, so use any brushes you want for this. You'll see the first thing I do when I add anything new to the scene is give it dimension. This is what makes something really sit into the scene and feel like it's part of the surroundings. I don't want these rocks to look pasted on top of the environment. I want them to settle into it. That means they need to obey the color perspective I've set up. The background is really cool with a narrow value range affected by atmospheric perspective. The human eye can understand a lot about how far away something is just based on value range. So when the values are compressed into this lighter mid-range, the object appears distant. So on the foothills, I've compressed the shadows into a lighter, cooler value range. Then in the midground, I want to keep everything fairly neutral, growing in richness and increasing the value range as it approaches the foreground, which I want to have the richest color and the fullest value range. That's what I'm building toward. I'm trying to keep this in mind even as I paint the rocks along the path, with the shadows having the most contrast and the richest colors down by the camera. The grass is still feeling pretty uniform and lacking in depth, so I'll need to work on that as I keep painting. You'll see me use the rake brush quite a bit to give the piece a more painted feel. I just really like this look. It feels kind of like traditional brush strokes. We've reached the point now where everything is more or less blocked in, and it's time to start rendering and adding detail. I start with the sunlight dappling brushes to add in little patches of grass that feel lighter. You can see that I vary the hue too as I move up toward the horizon. This is going to be a process of going from grass brush to grass brush, picking out various detail brushes and placing them here and there until I get the effect I want. One technique you'll see me use a lot is establishing little pockets or zones of color and then adding detail right along the division where the patch of color meets its surroundings. This is a really effective life hack for applying detail. Another cool thing about the human eye is it actually does a lot of the work for us. We don't need to detail every inch of our canvas. In fact, we shouldn't. It's much more effective to detail the focal zones of the image, to pick areas of higher contrast, like where light meets shadow, and add all of our details right there along the division. The human eye sees that detail, and the brain goes, yeah, that sounds right. The whole thing must have that same level of detail, because that's what's logical. And we interpret the whole field as having detail. I learned from the best. I also learned that pockets of color think from the best. I learned almost everything I know about painting grass from Studio Ghibli, if I'm being honest. So I'm really just moving around the field, adding pockets of color, making sure those pockets of color are shaped properly in perspective, and then adding detail around them to indicate the grass texture. I also want to make this path feel organic and overgrown, so I'll use the shorter mossy grass brushes to draw in shorter grass, kind of trampled over so never getting very tall, but still there poking through. Something else that helps our fields look a lot more real is having different lengths of grass. Clearly showing a transition between shorter grass and longer grass makes the whole thing feel a lot more real and visceral, so I included a handful of brushes in this pack specifically for that. Next, I'm blocking in some plants and trying to give them clear silhouettes, which will help them stand out against the field and will give the scene more clarity. I want it to be really clear exactly where each plant is growing from. Something that can happen a lot when painting nature is everything turning into kind of a uniform mush that makes it all flatten, and it totally destroys the depth. So I go out of my way to avoid that, trying to really clearly place every single thing on a defined spot in the ground and give everything clear silhouettes. That's what helps them read. To bring the foreground forward even more, I want to increase the contrast, add darker darks and lighter lights near each other to make it noisier and draw the eye down. We can see the detail a lot more easily when something is close by, so increasing the detail level and the contrast level of that detail is a great method for making the foreground feel closer to the viewer, increasing that sense of real distance and space in the painting. Now it's time for the colorful fun part, adding wildflowers. I wanted this to be a beautiful flower-covered mountain meadow from the beginning, but first I had to lay the groundwork. Now it's all set up and ready for flowers. Flowers are another great way to show perspective because we can clearly depict the same flower getting smaller and smaller as it goes back in space until it becomes nothing but noise. Repeated elements moving back in perspective are an immediate visual cue that the eye latches onto to understand the physical space. I'm following that same perspective pattern with the flowers, creating really narrow stripes of color up by the horizon, which slowly open up as we get closer to the camera. I'm keeping the colors all within a kind of pink, purple, orange gamut, but varying the hue enough that they feel organic and fresh. I paint in a couple clearly defined flowers in the midground to indicate that they exist all throughout the piece, even though most of the flowers are just colorful noise, and the brain fills in all the gaps. I decide that I want some more shadows across the field, kind of like clouds overhead are blocking out some of the light. And these more powerful stripes of shadow and light, they also help the feeling of depth because they give the viewer a physical indication of the distance, of physical space moving back toward the mountains, falling in and out of light. I use multiply layers for big sweeping shadows like this. The multiply blending mode is really useful for that. And I'll usually follow up with a curves adjustment to perfect the values. You can see I'm thinking big picture now because I make my canvas smaller on the screen. This is important for judging the image as a whole. I want to make sure my entire painting is reading clearly and works together, not just individual zoomed in details. So remember to zoom out. And now I'm just painting some final details on top, a little bit of rendering here and there in the foreground until the piece feels complete. Thanks for watching along. If you painted along with this video, I'd love to see your mountain field too. Tag it with #DevonBrushes and I'll poke around in that tag from time to time. The link to download the brushes is down below in the description, and here's the final piece, which I turned into the cover image for the brush set. See you guys next time!